Scotland, you may know it as the northern half of Great Britain, and home to a people and kingdom that even in the face of defeat, after defeat, after defeat, after defeat, after defeat, still call out for freedom from their southern neighbour. And of course, as the age of colonialism rose, so did Scotland try its hand at colonial expansion itself in the Americas, establishing but then quickly abandoning colonial efforts in Nova Scotia, New Jersey, and North Carolina. And while these efforts failed, England, France, Spain, Holland, and Portugal all began staking their claims on the New World. Scotland would soon find itself virtually outcast from colonizing by the other European empires, who didn't want another competitor on the American continental scene. This would leave Scotland's economy keeling over following embargoes by its competitors, but in a last-ditch effort, knowing this would be do or die for their economy, Scotland mustered together roughly a quarter of all remaining funds in the country and mounted a voyage for Panama to establish the colony of New Caledonia, from which they would create a speedy trade route. But the Panama Canal wasn't a thing yet, nor was the technology to build it, so Scotland would have to develop the region first and transport goods by road from one coast to another. The Scots, in our timeline, did no such thing. The mountainous and tropical jungles were far more than the Scots had expected, leading many to simply give up on the colony, as they had before, or succumb to tropical diseases, while Spain, who already had laid claims to Panama, simply seized the land back. Scotland was broke, hungry, and desperate to survive. Thus, England enters and basically says, "Oi, Scotland, I think it's time you allow me to consume you." Scotland had desperately tried to avoid this proposal, but now England had her begging on her knees. The Acts of Union were passed, and Scotland became but a part of Great Britain. But what if all that changed? The Scottish plan to colonize Panama was known as the Darian Scheme, named after the Darien Gulf. It was an operation both poorly planned and poorly funded, and ultimately proved to be a greater net loss than a gain. To correct this mistake, Will instead proposed that in this timeline, rather than plotting a number of previously failed expeditions in the north, Scotland instead sends team after team of voyagers to survey and lay the groundwork for a full colonization operation in the mid-1690s. England and Spain would still harass the settlement, British ships working to undermine the voyage and shipments sent from Scotland to the colony, and Spain sieging the colony by land and sea. While Scotland's navy had much to be desired, their military regiments were actually some of the most well-organized and resilient of the times. Had Scotland invested greater efforts into creating an initial soldier colony, their defensive capabilities in the Americas might have been enough to discourage further aggressions from Spain. So with that strategy, Scotland would send hunters, cartographers, and a small working force first, then a garrison of soldiers to occupy and defend the colony as it took shape, and finally pioneering citizens, merchants, and the like. As 1700 rolled around, Spain found itself seeking a new heir to the throne, disagreements arose, and the War of Spanish Succession broke out as in our timeline, with Austria, England, the Netherlands, and Portugal siding with Austrian Habsburg claimant to the throne Charles II, while France and Spain backed Bourbon claimant Philip of France, who the former Spanish king had left the empire to in his will. Scotland had in our timeline for the most part stayed out of the conflict. This time around, Will proposed that they involve themselves in the war, being little benefit to either side, but for their efforts would be granted a significant portion of the land surrounding the Darien colony to create a protective buffer state between it and New Spain. And as the timeline continues on, things remain more or less like our timeline, with one exception. The Acts of Union are never signed, and thus England is very twitchy toward its northern neighbor. The Scots had an old alliance with France, and for them to side with England against France in the War of Spanish Succession might have made England and the rest of Europe feel as though the Scots were untrustworthy. England especially because it shared a border with Scotland and was concerned that it may form alliances against the interests of the crown. This would lead to repeated acts of aggression towards Scotland and their growing but still highly underdeveloped navy. A navy which would further expand Scotland's route to Asia with the establishment of a colony off the coast of New Guinea. For some, this would be an era of peace and continued growth for the Scottish Empire, but to others it would be clear that tension between the two empires of England and Scotland would soon come to a boiling point, and that now was not the time for expansion, but the time for modernization and securing of the land holding Scotland already held. But while expansion would continue into New Guinea, the Falkland Islands, and the tip of Australia to establish further trade colonies, New Caledonia and Panama developing well into a populated settler colony whose infrastructure was finally beginning to make the region welcoming to the less adventurous of the Scottish population, as well as other Celtic peoples from Ireland, Wales, and Cornwall, creating a community very distinct from that of the New England colonies up north. In the region, English would still be commonly spoken, but more prominently would be the Scottish dialect of Gaelic. Now, immediately following the establishment of the colony, Scotland was still facing financial crisis. but was willing to gamble losing it all if it meant giving the colony the time it needed to become the treasure trove they believed it could be. And not too long later, it began paying off in production of sugarcane and trade, not only with the West but across the globe. Scottish merchants being revered as some of the best in all the world, rivaling that of even the Dutch. But their ships still lagged behind. England did not appreciate the competition that was now siphoning away half of their profits, and would continue further escalating their rivalry. In 1730, we'd see what would come to be known as the First Anglo-Scottish Imperial War, where the dominance of both empires would be challenged, following the British attack of a Scottish merchant ship far beyond the range of English trade routes. The English Navy would wipe out with little hesitation the Scottish Atlantic Fleet and blockade New Caledonia, along with their southern Argentinian port colony. However, back on the mainland, the Scots would advance into English land with their ground forces, only to be stopped at the last minute by a defensive garrison of troops armed with superior weaponry. The English would emerge victorious and take precious New Caledonia as their own, leaving the Scots only the Falkland Islands as a port within all of South America. With the trade empire's hub captured, Scottish Australia and New Guinea, seeing far less trade, become a more permanent residence for the Scottish merchants and soldiers stationed there, creating two new growing settler colonies in the Pacific in the decades following the war. And speaking of settler colonies, the United States would by this time, in 1776, declare independence from England, who would have, after the Scottish War, French-Indian War, and American Revolution, and now the colonization of India, find itself worn out. Enough so that when subsequent revolutions inspired by the US began to manifest, so would New Caledonia and South New Caledonia demand their freedom from the English in 1786, becoming independent nations loyal to the Scottish Crown, equivalent to the dominions of the British Commonwealth. The English, simply not having this because of course they wouldn't, go whole hog in their assertion of colonial dominance over Scotland by retaking Panama through naval superiority, but being unable to capture more than the coastal regions of New Caledonia, establish English Cape Colony to compete with the lone Scottish trade port in the region, and declare Western Australia wholly English land. And while this had spread the English thin once again, they may have very well been able to challenge the Scots yet again. But as the early 1800s roll around, so does Napoleon seize power and begin his campaign across Europe. The coalition forces of Europe, with a far weakened England, stand no chance. Scotland and the French rekindle an alliance to knock out the English so that France would not need to waste troops in a naval war with England. By 1810, the French Empire had dominated the majority of mainland Western Europe, while Scotland saw to the invasion and capitulation of England, France sending a single navy force to demonstrate to the king how dire the situation the Empire would be in if a surrender was not made. Scotland would lay claims to many of England's ancestrally Celtic lands, including Ireland and Wales, while also annexing the whole of Australia and establishing the Celtic Empire, comprised of New Caledonia, South New Caledonia, Australia, New Guinea, Ireland, Cape Colony, and the majority of Britain. The few settlers sent to Australia by England, many of which would have been prisoners, are sent to New Zealand instead, which becomes the de facto British colony. Canada, being mostly autonomous, but still loyal to England, of course, remains as it is, while what remains of English colonial ambitions is funneled into India, as the Dutch had done with Indonesia, one large single resource colony with a number of minuscule trade ports across various islands and coasts. As our world saw an era of British and later Germanic prominence, so would this world's political and cultural scene be dominated by French and Celtic culture, as Napoleon installed his familial dynasty across the royal seats of his client states. Various dialects of Gaelic and Gaelic, as well as Celtic culture, would thrive in this world as Scotland grew into a financial and industrial titan in the decades to come. And that is where I'm going to end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.